Hi guys, welcome back. It's time for the Call of the Wild Part 9. We're still back with Mercedes, Hal, and Charles to find out what's causing them more grievances this time. Ready? Mercedes nervoused a special grievance. That means she's upset about something. The grievance of sex. She was pretty and soft and had been chivalrously treated all her days. That means that she was always treated like a lady. But the present treatment by her husband and brother was everything save chivalrous. It was hard to say. It was her custom to be helpless. They complained, upon which impeachment of what to her was her most essential sex prerogative, she made their lives unendurable. So she said that she didn't have to work because she was a girl. That's not true. We know that. She no longer considered the dogs, and because she was sore and tired, she persisted in riding on the sled. She was pretty and soft, but she weighed 120 pounds. I wonder who that is. A lusty last straw to a load, dragged by weak and starving animals. She rode for days till they fell in the traces and the sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk, pleaded with her, entreated, the while she wept and importuned heaven with a recital of their brutality. On one occasion they took her off the sled by main strength. They never did it again. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child and sat down on the trail. They went on their way, but she did not move. After they had traveled 3 miles, they unloaded the sled, came back for her, and by main strength put her on the sled again. In the excess of their own misery, they were callous to the suffering of their animals. Hal's theory, which he practiced on others, was that one must get hardened. He had started out preaching it to his sister and brother-in-law. Failing there, he hammered it into the dogs with a club. At the 5 fingers, the dog food gave out, and a toothless old squaw offered to trade them a few pounds of frozen horsehide for the Colt's revolver that kept the big hunting knife company at Hal's hip. Poor substitute for food was this hide, just as it had been stripped from the starved horses of the cattlemen 6 months back. In its frozen state, it was more like strips of galvanized iron. Ugh. And when a dog wrestled it into his stomach, it thawed into thin and innutritious leather strings and into a mass of short hair, irritating and indigestible. And through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the team as in a nightmare. He pulled when he could. When he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained down till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. All the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful furry coat. The hair hung down, limp and draggled, or matted with dried blood where Hal's club had bruised him. His muscles had wasted away to knotty strings, and the flesh pads had disappeared so that each rib and every bone in his frame was outlined cleanly through the loose hide wrinkled in folds of emptiness. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. As it was with Buck, so it was with his mates. They were perambulating skeletons. That means they were moving skeletons. There were 7 altogether, including him. In their very great misery, they had become insensible to the bite of the lash or the bruise of the club. The pain of the beating was dull and distant, just as the things their eyes saw and their ears heard seemed dull and distant. There were simply so many bags of bones in which sparks of life fluttered faintly. When a halt was made, they dropped down in the traces like dead dogs, and the spark dimmed and paled and seemed to go out. When the club or whip fell upon them, the spark fluttered feebly up, and they tottered on. There came a day when Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Hal had traded off his revolver, so he took the axe and knocked Billy in the head as he lay in the traces, then cut the carcass out of the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw, and his mates saw, and they knew that this thing was very close to them. On the next day, Kuna went, and but 5 of them remained. Joe, too far gone to be malignant. Pike, crippled and limping, only half conscious and not conscious enough longer to malinger. Solix, the one-eyed, still faithful to the toil of trace and trail, and mournful in that he had so little strength with which to pull. Teek, who had not traveled so far that winter, and was now beaten more than the others because he was fresher. And Buck, still at the head of the team, but no longer enforcing discipline or striving to enforce it, blind with weakness, and keeping the trail by the loom of it and by the dim feel of his feet. It was a beautiful spring weather, but neither dogs nor humans were aware of it. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later, was dawn by 3 in the morning, and twilight lingered till 9 at night. The whole long day was a blaze of sunshine. The ghostly winter silence had given way to the great spring murmur of awakening life. This murmur arose from all the land, fraught with the joy of living, came from the things that lived and moved again, things which had been as dead and which had not moved during the long months of frost. The sap was rising in the pines. The willows and aspens were bursting out in young buds. Shrubs and vines were putting on fresh garbs of green. Crickets sang in the nights, and in the days all manner of creeping, crawling things rustled forth into the sun. Partridges and woodpeckers were booming and knocking in the forest. Squirrels were chattering, birds singing, and overhead honked the wild fowl, that's a geese, driving up from the south in cunning wedge that split the air. From every hill slope came the trickle of running water. Hill slope. Came the trickle of running water, the music of unseen fountains. All things were thawing, bending, snapping. The Yukon was straining to break loose the ice that bound it down. It ate away from beneath. The sun ate from above. Air holes formed. Fissures sprang and spread apart, while thin sections of ice fell through bodily into the river. Amid all this bursting, rending, throbbing of awakening life, under the blazing sun and through the soft, sighing breezes, like wayfarers to death staggered the two men, the woman, and the huskies. With the dogs falling, Mercedes weeping and riding, Hal swearing innocuously, that's hard to say, and Charles' eyes wistfully watering. That means he's swearing a lot, just so you know. They staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of White River. When they halted, the dogs dropped down as though they had all been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log to rest. He sat down very slowly and painstakingly, what of his great stiffness. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling the last touches of an axe handle he had made from a stick of birch. He listened, gave monosyllabic replies, and when it was asked, terse advice. He knew the breed, and he gave his advice in the certainty that it would not be followed. There's John Thornton with Buck. They told us up at the bottom of was dropping out of the trail, and that the best thing for us to do was to lay over, Hal said in response to Thornton's warning to take no more chances on the rotten ice. They told us we couldn't make White River, and here we are. This last was a sneering ring of triumph to it. And they told you true, John Thornton answered. The bottom's likely to drop out at any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my carcass on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. So carcass is your body. And just your body. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Hal. All the same, we'll go on to Dawson. He uncoiled his whip. Get up there, Buck. Hey, get up there, mush on. Thornton went on whittling. It was idle, he knew, to get between a fool and his folly, while 2 or 3 fools more or less would not alter the scheme of things. But the team did not get up at the command. The log since passed into the stage where blows were required to rouse it. The whip flashed out here and there on its merciless errands. John Thornton compressed his lips. Sullox was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell over when half up, and on the third attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he neither whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started, as though to speak, but changed his mind. A moisture came into his eyes, and as the whipping continued, he arose and walked irresolutely up and down. This was the first time Buck had failed. In itself a sufficient reason to drive Hal into a rage. Exchanged the whip for the customary club, Buck refused to move under the rain of heavier blows which now fell upon him. Like his mates, he was barely able to get up, but unlike them, he had made up his mind not to get up. He had a vague feeling of impending doom. This had been strong upon him when he pulled into the bank, and it had not departed from him. What of the thin and rotten ice he had felt under his feet all day? It seemed that he sensed disaster close at hand, out there ahead on the ice where his master was trying to drive him. He refused to stir. So greatly had he suffered, and so far gone was he, that the blows did not hurt much. And as they continued to fall upon him, the spark of life within flickered and went down. It was nearly out. He felt strangely numb, as though from a great distance he was aware that he was being beaten. The last sensations of pain left him. He no longer felt anything, though very faintly he could hear the impact of the club upon his body. But it was no longer his body. It seemed so far away. And then, suddenly, without warning, uttering a cry that was inarticulate, and more like the cry of an animal, John Thornton sprang upon the man who wielded the club. Hal was hurled backward as though struck by a falling tree. Mercedes screamed. Charles looked on wistfully, wiping his watery eyes, but did not get up because of his stiffness. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggling to control himself, too convulsed with rage to speak. That means he was shaking with rage. If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you, he at last managed to say in a choked voice. It's my dog, Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson. Thornton stood between him and Buck, and evinced no intention of getting out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, laughed, and manifested the despotic abandonment of hysteria. Sounds like hysteria. Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with the axe handle, knocked the knife to the ground. He rapped his knuckles again as he tried to pick it up. Then he stooped, picked it up himself, and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were full with his sister, or his arms rather, while Buck was too near dead to be of further use in hauling the sled. A few minutes later, they pulled out from the bank and down the river. Buck heard them go and raised his head to see. Pike was leading. Sulux was at the wheel, and between were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled. Hal guided at the gee pole, and Charles stumbled along in the rear. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him and with rough, kindly hands searched for broken bones. By the time his search had disclosed nothing more than many bruises and a state of terrible starvation, the sled was a quarter of a mile away. Dog and man watched it crawling over the ice. Suddenly they saw its back end drop down, as into a rut, and the gee-pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerked into the air. Mercedes' scream came to their ears. They saw Charles turn and make one step to run back. Then a whole section of ice gave away, and dogs and humans disappeared. A yawning hole was all that was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "The poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hands. "Oh, that's a shame." So, when someone tells you the ice is not solid enough to support you, maybe you should listen. All right, we'll talk again next time. See you later.